everybody, and welcome back to the Ultimate Fashion History with me, fashion historian and Bette Davis fanatic, Amanda Halley, in a little series we have running on the channel called That Dress, where we look at some of fashion history and movie history's most iconic dresses. And I am so excited for this episode because we are going to be looking at Edith Head for Bette Davis in 1950's All About Eve. So, pour yourself a drink. How about a milkshake? And fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy episode. Just to remind you that I don't do comments here on YouTube. What a dump. Head over to Facebook and join our Facebook group. We have thousands of really great members, wonderful company, and also you can subscribe at any point during this video by clicking the subscribe button. All About Eve debuted in 1950 and has gone on to become one of the most beloved movies of all time, and certainly one of the best movies about actors, the acting profession, aging, insecurity, ambition, drive, vanity, and underhandedness that's ever been made. The human condition, basically. It was directed by Joseph L. Mankiewicz, who also wrote the adapted screenplay, and it starred Bette Davis, Anne Baxter at her most fabulously creepy, George Sanders, Celeste Holm, all of them at the top of their game. Even Gary Merrill was pretty good in it, and, well, you know, that says something. The costumes for All About Eve were by both Charles Lemaire and Edith Head. Edith designed for her friend Bette Davis, and Bette insisted that Mankiewicz borrow her from Paramount for this 20th Century Fox production, and Charles Lemaire designed for everybody else. And he did a great job, although of course he wasn't too thrilled to learn that he would be sharing costume credit with Edith Head and that she'd get to wardrobe the lead. Well, believe it or not, I have one degree of separation from Edith Head. In 1979, I think, my dad, David Wolfe, interviewed her for a magazine that he was the editor of and spent the day with her at whatever studio she was working at, and boy oh boy, did he have a good time. And of course, they talked about that dress. When I told him I was putting this episode together, he dug out the magazine, scanned the interview, and sent it to me. So I'm going to upload it into the Ultimate Fashion History Facebook group if any of you would like to read it. That's not the only familial connection I have with All About Eve. Well, apart from Bette Davis, our favourite performance in All About Eve came courtesy of George Sanders and the sinister and snake-like Addison DeWitt. We have a very special place in our hearts for George Sanders here. We really do. You know my husband's publishing company, Dean Street Press. Well, we are the sole publishers of George Sanders' fantastic autobiography, Memoirs of a Professional Cad. Every month it is always and continuously one of our biggest sellers. It is so good. We also republish George Sanders' detective novels. He had a couple, like Crime on My Hands and Stranger at Home. They're really good as well. I'll leave a link to all of our George Sanders books in the description area too. All About Eve was based on an original story by Mary Orr on the experiences of this beautiful lady here, the Austrian actress Elizabeth Bergner, during her 1940s run of the play The Two Mrs. Carrolls, which of course was made into a movie in 1947, starring Humphrey Bogart and Barbara Stanwyck. Evidently, Miss Bergner had a rather climbing and duplicitous assistant, and Mary Orr thought this would make for a great short story. It did, but it made for an even better movie. I know that if you're watching this episode, there is nothing, absolutely nothing, that I can teach you about All About Eve. I am preaching to the choir, I know that, but just bear with me. Bette Davis took the role of Margot Channing, but this was her comeback role after her dramatic firing from Warner Brothers. So this role and this movie were extremely important to Bette Davis. However, she almost didn't get to wear that dress because originally the role of Margot Channing was given to Claudette Colbert, Colbert, however, ruptured a disc prior to filming and had to pull out. The movie needed a Margot. And some other actresses were tipped for and campaigned for the part, including Tallulah Bankhead, Gertrude Lawrence, and Marlene Dietrich. I love Claudette Colbert, but I think she's intrinsically too nice to play Margot at some of her scrappier moments. Tallulah Bankhead might have been great. Gertrude Lawrence was very funny. And I think maybe with that sort of stoic, placid, and often sarcastic delivery, Dietrich might have been good. Can you imagine it? Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night. I sound like Arnold Schwarzenegger. That was terrible. But however great these ladies may have been, come on, All About Eve was all about Betty. So let's look at that dress, first quite analytically, and then I want to share with you why I think that dress was so right for that party scene. Here is a still of Margot making her entrance, and here is the dress from the front and the dress from the back. But what you are looking at here isn't the actual dress from the movie. That has seemingly disappeared into the ether. Nobody knew at the time just how iconic this dress would become. What you are looking at here is one of at least two replicas. Edith Head had a replica of the dress made to tour with, and Betty Davis also asked for a replica. This is Betty Davis's replica dress, and I know this because it was auctioned at Heritage Auctions, who state that this dress was owned by Betty Davis. They're very sure of the provenance because she gifted it to costume designer Don Feld, who she had a very good relationship with and a friendship with in the 60s and beyond. In fact, she insisted that he designed the clothes for her 1964 movie Dead Ringer. Anyway, back to that dress. It's made of a rich chocolate brown Gros de Londres silk, which means it's very heavy, and trimmed with sable at the pockets and 3/4 length sleeves. It had a heavy tulle crinoline petticoat and diamante clips at the cuffs in the sable. It's clearly influenced by the new look Dior, Jacques Fat, et al. And Betty refused to wear a bra, as we all know, and I think she probably refused to wear a girdle. So bone support was sewn directly into the dress to keep Betty firm and not too bouncy. The brooch that Miss Davis wore with this gown, and here it is, was created by Joseph of Hollywood out of simulated diamonds, and Julian's auction house estimates its value today at between $5,000 and $7,000. That's a lot of money for a paste brooch, but it's so iconic. Interestingly, this brooch was recycled by the studio. Here it is, as worn by Jane Russell in 1951's His Kind of Woman. And I know what you're all thinking. You're thinking, Amanda, are you going to talk about the off-the-shoulder myth? All of you who know this movie, all of you who know this dress, will know what I'm about to talk about. As we all know, the dress is off the shoulder. But originally it wasn't supposed to be. It was on the shoulder with a square neckline. Now the legend goes that the dress was a little bit delayed in being produced. It was the day that Mankiewicz was going to start shooting the party scenes. The dress arrived. Edith was fitting it to Betty Davis and realized that there had been some sort of error when the measurements were taken, and the shoulders were far too big and didn't fit. The legend goes that Edith was about to run down to the studio and tell Mankiewicz that he would have to postpone filming when Betty, standing in front of the mirror, pulled the sleeves down past her shoulders and said, "Don't you think it looks better this way anyway?" Or words to that effect. Edith agreed with a few strategic stitches so that it fit properly and wouldn't slip anymore. And voila, one of the most famous off-the-shoulder dresses in all of movie history was born. However, is this just a Hollywood story? Well, In Edith Head's book, Edith Head's Hollywood, she tells the same story. The book has a foreword written by Bette Davis, her friend, and even though neither of these ladies was evidently shy of letting the truth get in the way of a good story, I can see no reason why they would make this up and stick to it over all these years. Now, there are some people who say that, well, that story can't be true because when you look at the original costume sketches, the dress is off the shoulder. Now, Edith worked with some very talented wardrobe sketch artists, and I think that these beautiful sketches were actually produced after the film to be included as part of the publicity package for the movie. Often costume sketches were included, especially when the publicity pack was being sent to fashion magazines and things like that, and so they were probably created after the movie. Another reason why I believe this story is because there exist so many costume tests from All About Eve. There is Anne Baxter in Charles Lemaire, and Marilyn Monroe in that beautiful Charles Lemaire gown that he created for her. Okay, you might be thinking, well, Charles Lemaire, he got the costume tests. Edith Head didn't, but there are plenty of All About Eve costume tests with Bette Davis as well. So I kind of believe the fact that if this dress, that dress, the one that we are talking about, doesn't appear in a costume test, not that I have seen anyway, I sort of tend to believe the story that its production was delayed, it arrived, it didn't fit, and the off-the-shoulder dress was born courtesy of Bette Davis. But also I think that Edith Head really trusted Betty's instinct. According to Edith Head, Mankiewicz had no interest in her costumes. He told Edith to, quote, "Do what you think is right. I love your work," end quote. However, Betty was always involved in costumes, and this is how Edith Head describes working with Bette Davis. She said, "Betty walks in here like a small, disciplined cyclone. You don't discuss details with Betty. She shows you how she is going to do the part, how she is going to throw herself on the bed, sit on the desk, or whirl around and walk out in a huff. That," says Betty, "is how I want the clothes to act." I love that. That is how I want the clothes to act. And in many ways, that dress was her co-star in the party scene. The heavy fabric made for a lot of huffy swishes. The off-the-shoulder touch added a ton of sex appeal, and those deep pockets were perfect for such a gestural and demonstrative actress. Betty really used her body when acting, and she used those pockets to great effect, either cheekily clipping her thumbs into them or thrusting her fists into them in angry defiance. That dress is almost, well, as alive as Bette Davis is in this movie, and I don't think anyone ever could wear it as well as the divine Miss D. Another thing I love about the dress is how it mirrors the dress that Anne Baxter wears in the party scene. Now, of course, Charlemagne did Baxter's costumes, but clearly Edith Head and Charles Lemaire worked together, or at least kept each other abreast of what they were doing, because look, both of the ladies have off-the-shoulder dresses. Baxter's, she's a younger pseudo-ingenue type, and so her dress is shorter. But when they're in scenes together, this has a great effect because it's almost like they are mirroring each other. And doesn't Eve want to mirror Margot? Isn't Eve the mirror image of a young Margot? I think this is very clever, and it's not the only time in All About Eve when Eve and Margot's costumes reflect each other's. Like here, for example, with the netting and the velvet bow. In the same scene here, the netting and the velvet strips. This is all very clever. Well, All About Eve was nominated for 14 Oscars and won 7. Mankiewicz won for Best Director and for Best Adapted Screenplay. George Sanders won for Best Supporting Actor, and Charles Lemaire and Edith Head shared for Best Costume. However, Edith Head won twice that year. How can that be? Well, as I know that you know, in this era, 2 Academy Awards were given each year for costume, one for black and white movies and one for color movies. Edith and Charles Lemaire won for All About Eve in the black and white category, and Edith Head and her team won for the sumptuous Samson and Delilah. What I also think is really interesting about the 1951 Academy Awards is this. When All About Eve came out in 1950, hardly anybody noticed Marilyn Monroe. She got good notices, but nobody thought, oh my goodness, here we have the next biggest megastar of the decade. In hindsight, it's nice to think that people did, and people say that they did, but actually they really didn't. So it's very interesting that within just a year from All About Eve's release, where she had such a tiny cameo, she was a presenter at the 1951 Academy Awards, presenting the award for Best Sound, which went to All About Eve. Another little thing I picked up on from the 1951 Academy Awards is this. When George Sanders was presented his Oscar for Best Supporting Actor, it was given to him by the Best Supporting Actress of 1950, Mercedes McCambridge. And look at her dress at the Oscars. Does it remind you of anything? It's so similar to Bette Davis's Margot Channing party scene dress, that dress. Well, I truly believe that dress is one of those serendipitous moments when actor, designer, narrative, and movie all come together perfectly. Edith Head famously said, "A designer is only as good as the star who wears her clothes." And I think in the case of that dress, these two friends, Edith Head and Bette Davis, did each other proud. And if this episode has left you hungry for more Edith Head, or just hungry in general, check out this episode on The Ultimate Fashion History, Edith Head's chicken and potatoes quesadilla recipe. A recipe, no doubt, she shared with Bette Davis over a good old gossip. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode here on The Ultimate Fashion History. I will leave the links to everything in the description part below, down there, you see it. Join us on Facebook to comment and just have some company. I'll be back very soon with more episodes on the UFH, so don't forget to subscribe. All right, bye for now.